Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Author Spotlight, and we are sponsored by your Author Hub, and I am your host, Cynthia Martin. I'm an avid book lover. I love to read. I love all kinds of books, as you can tell. And here on the Author Spotlight, we talk to all kinds of authors about their books, about their writing, about their style, and about their habit. So today we have a new author that I just met. I'm real excited to hear about her book. I want you to join me as we welcome Marcia Fleischman, and she's going to share with us her book, If God is Love, Why Do I Feel So Bad? What a great title. And the subtitle is Considering Our Images of God. So, Marcia, tell us a little bit about who you are and a little bit about that interesting sounding book.
Well, good to meet you, Cynthia. Thanks for having me. Well, I'm just an ordinary person who has been looking for God all my life. And I would say the journey started, I grew up in church. I started really wondering about fifth grade, what was going on, what was the real story. And I've pursued God forever since then in many different environments. Through the Jesus movement in the 70s, I gave my life to Christ and had a real spiritual opening and awakening. And I just kept pursuing God. So in my adult life, my husband, before we got married, found a wonderful church that was alive and full of the Spirit. And I continued to deepen in my experience. I started on the mystical path of listening to God and communing with God. And that has been very fulfilling to me. I'm also on a healing journey. I found God's love to be extremely healing and getting that deeper and deeper into my life. So that's just been the pursuit of my life. The big change came when I was 48 and I was diagnosed with a fatal illness. I took Fen-Phen, the diet medication, and I got the fatal illness that they didn't tell people about. The only way out was a double lung transplant, the only way to survive. So I was sick for 5.5 years. And then it was time to go get a transplant. I had to move to St. Louis. I'm in Kansas City area, move across state, and I waited for a lung transplant. Well, I got the transplant, came back to Kansas City. By that time, I was on staff at Broadway Baptist Church, now called Broadway Church. And I was working in children's ministry. Then I moved to small group ministry. Then I was preaching. Anyhow, we were trying to raise money for the kitchen remodeling that hadn't been remodeled since 1932. And I said, well, a volunteer at the transplant place, spent our renewal time, our rehab time, painting with us, showing us how to paint. And that was my first experience. I'd always wanted to paint. My mother painted. Anyhow, I said, well, a kitchen remodeling, maybe I like angel stories. I said, maybe I could paint some pictures of angels and sell them to raise money for the kitchen. And the Spirit spoke to me and said, no such thing as old visions of angels, Marcia. I'll give you new visions to paint. And I said, well, that's fun, God, but I don't know how to draw. So I had a Picasso book and I looked at that and thought, oh, I can do something simple. Anyhow, the next day in quiet time, this image popped in my mind and I just started drawing them. Then I got big art paper and started redoing them, drawing and painting. Anyhow, I sold them and made $5,000 for the kitchen remodeling. And these bright images of angels that are just powerful, unlike anything I'd ever seen. So that actually is one of my first books, is Angels I've Seen. So I continued to draw, and I did a series on women in the Bible that I call Wild Woman Theology in the Arms of Loving Mother God, how the stories of the women would change from a feminine viewpoint. And so that was the second book, and the stories are all channeled. Basically, I sat down and wrote the stories in 15 minutes and they all rhyme. It was an amazing experience. So that was my second one. But my third book, If God is Love, Why Do I Feel So Bad? Started when I read a book called Good Goats, Bad Goats by Denis, Matthew, and Sheila Linn. And Denis, the writer, is a Dominican priest, and he posits that he noticed in himself when his image of God changed, he changed. He had been in a position of being judgmental and angry and reflected that to other people. But then as he got more acquainted with God in a real intimate sort of way, he became more loving. And that just piqued my interest. So I started observing people and how they talked about God, what Bible references they used to describe God. And I started noticing when people held on to this angry God and they had permission to be angry and judgmental. And then as they grasped the concept and communed with God, they became more loving. Richard Rohr is one of my favorite writers, and he writes that our image of God creates our life. And that just affirmed that I needed to pursue this. So I started interviewing people about what their ideas were, about what their images of God. We had a new worship person at Broadway, and he had a friend who came to visit, and the worship guy said, at this church, they practice this listening prayer. They believe they can hear God speaking to them. What do you think of that? And the guy said, oh, I don't even want God to know where I am, much less talk to me. And
Oh my.
that said it again, like, what kind of image does he have of God that he feels
Yeah.
that way? And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have contaminated images of God, where Jesus came to talk about God's love and acceptance. And so my purpose was to create the images that people were sharing, and some that I came up with on my own, and to challenge people. This book is a workbook, so it challenges people with the images to sit and write about what that image means to them. Is it true for them? Is it not? How are they dealing with these images? And hopefully to move them along and change their images of God so they can feel God's love.
That it's utterly fascinating. If you can see probably by a lot of the background of my books is a Christian, a spirit-filled Christian. So I'm with you right there. You know, the 70s movement. I was a teenager in those years, so I wasn't quite involved with that, but I've been very involved in all kinds of spirit-filled ministries for over 20 years. So I'm on page with you. I teach people how to hear from God. That's one of the things I
All
do in my
right.
own
Great. I
in
love
my
it.
own ministry. So I love that you do that, because if we serve, which if is a small if, because I believe I do serve a very big God, but if we serve this big God and he's speaking all the time and we have relationship with him, how can you have a relationship with someone who doesn't speak? And God, I believe God's speaking all the time. We just need to tune ourselves, to tune our spirit to be able to hear what he's saying.
I
But I'd
agree.
like to address, because the elephant in the room, and if you don't mind, hopefully I won't be putting you on the spot, but you used a couple of words that would really send someone off the deep end. And I just want to clarify, you know, this is your interview and I just want to hear what you
Sure.
have to say about it. You use the word channel and you use the word mystic. Now, those are words that we generally attribute to a new age or another spiritual, the universe is God, we're all God's movement. How do you define those words?
Well, channeling to me is just a process, and it's what you've mentioned. It's hearing from God.
Yeah.
And so for me, channeling is hearing the Spirit speak and writing what I speak.
I
Um,
agree. I just wanted to make sure that,
that's
because
good. Yeah.
you have people listen to this and they'll think, oh no, that's
Oh,
that's
that,
that
yeah,
spiritual
taboo.
stuff, you know, where we can all be gods and we're just listening to the universe and getting vibrations and so on and
Yes.
so
No,
forth. Which,
it's
you know, if
about the
that's what you've
Spirit.
written, I want to honor that. But I agree. I will use the word conduit.
I
It's
like
the
it.
same thing.
Yes.
We're the vessel through which we connect and then we speak, or you through your drawing, or however else you can convey what you believe God is speaking. So I totally agree with that. The channeling. And what about the mystic part?
With a mystic, this is interesting. I tell a lot of personal stories in this book, and one I quote Karl Rahner, who was a priest, a German priest in the 60s, who said, in the future, the devout Christian will be a mystic or nothing at all.
Hmm.
And I use the term mystic as one who experiences the divine,
Okay.
experiences God, one who communes with God and depends on that experience. I know you have the experience,
Right.
so I would consider you a mystic.
Yeah.
But it's a term
I
that
have, go ahead.
it's a term that's coming. I think it's the future of Christianity, as those of us who love hearing from spirit will continue to encourage in others.
And I agree with you in the aspect of um sometimes they're just semantics of what
Yes,
one person believes something to be, but another person will they hear the word and they're just off. Oh, I'm not listening to that
true.
person.
The word
So
turns them
that's
off.
why I'm not shy. So I'm going to ask, let's talk about, because I have a lot of dialogue with a lot of people that believe totally different than I do. But I'm
Yeah,
okay with that because I'm just having a dialogue. They're probably not going to change my beliefs because I'm very grounded in what I believe.
yeah.
I have my beliefs are based on the word of God, and I'm not moving. But I love to hear what other people think and believe. And I do think we're right on the same page. It's just that those two words made me question.
Jumped
Let's
out
just
at you.
make sure we're on the same page, because I didn't want to go off and ask you questions that you're like, no, that's not where I'm coming from.
Yeah,
So
nope.
I celebrate with you that you hear the voice of the Lord.
Yeah.
So, and apparently you also see, is that right? You're also a seer as well as a hearer.
Yes. Yes. I have what they call visions. They're just
Mhm.
pictures that pop
Yep.
in my mind. Like if I would ask you, can you see yourself having breakfast today? Can you see yourself sitting there and what did you
Mhm.
eat? Can you see what does a picture pop in mind?
Right.
Yeah, it's
My
that it's
husband,
like that.
yeah, my husband's a seer. My husband's a dreamer.
Okay.
He's a seer. I'm not, I don't see as much as I'm a knower. I know things. And
Yes,
so
excellent.
it's just a different way that the Holy Spirit uses us.
In different
And
ways
it's
the
just the way we
spirits
do.
Yeah,
Mhm.
different ways the spirit speaks to us, sometimes with pictures, sometimes impressions, sometimes words, sometimes scriptures,
Yep.
many different ways that the spirit speaks.
Yeah, so I think that's really fascinating. I've never met anyone who has drawn from things they've heard or seen. I run with people who talk about, what they saw in the spirit or what they heard in the spirit or what they dreamed, or, so that's not unusual language for me. And I just want to explore that for the audience because I think it's kind of unusual. I think we're in a smaller number than what is usual. And I don't like to use
Yes,
that word, sadly, because I think that these are gifts that are available to all who believe in the Lord. And he wants to speak in us and to us and through us. He really
yes.
does. And let's go back to the topic of the book, and also I want to talk about the drawing and the painting. I'm fascinated that you didn't really have any art lessons, or that
No,
you just picked it up and then you sold these paintings for so much money to help your church. And I just think that's wonderful. Um,
yes, it's quite the adventure.
yeah, I would imagine it was. So how exciting. So through this, when you do these paintings, or I'm assuming, is it paint? Is it oil or watercolors
It's
or
acrylic. When you have a
okay.
lung transplant, you can't use oils
Okay.
because the turpentine's bad on the lungs. So
Okay.
acrylic, it's water-based and it's fast. I like to be fast.
You and I would get along. I always tell my husband
I
I'm
think
always get it
so.
done, get it done, get it done. I'm always running 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So these are do you share those with people regularly, or are they just in your books now, or how do people learn how to do this sort of thing? I'm assuming you teach this, or share with people how it can happen.
Teach which part? The drawing?
The hearing from God and
Oh, hearing.
expressing it through painting, or those who paint. I believe all creative people have that ability. I really do.
Yes. Well,
Not
I
celebrated
certainly didn't
enough.
think I did, but I do.
Right.
And I was 53 when I started painting.
Wow.
Well, I'm in a small group, an Integral Christian Network, a small group, and we care and share, and we do resonating prayer, which is listening to spirit for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fascinating, wonderfully loving experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I just encourage people, if they feel drawn to drawing something. For years, I wanted to paint the visions I'd had, and I just never did it until after my transplant.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just encourage people to try.
Yeah.
My drawings are very simple,
Yeah.
and um, and people can do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But one caveat I always share with people when they're learning to hear from God is that hearing from God always feels like love.
Mhm.
Always. It's never a condemning voice. It may be a confrontation, it may be something, but it feels loving. And so
Yeah.
that's why I always want to invite people into that experience. But I'll tell you one of the funny stories, because the problem with hearing God, like for 25 years, I used to sit every morning and write in a notebook, and I'd ask God a question and just write what I was hearing.
Exactly.
And one
Which
day,
is a great way to recognize that you're hearing from God, I might add. It's a
yes,
great way to
yes.
start.
Good way to start.
Mhm.
So one day in church, one of the worship leaders was saying, well, this is what I heard from God this morning. And God said, da 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 da. And I'm sitting there going, gee, God, I wish I could hear from you like Marilyn hears from you. And
Mhm.
God spoke to me and said, oh, you do. You just don't believe me.
Exactly.
And that's kind
Exactly.
of the hard part.
Mhm.
Mm,
Yeah. And I think, writing is, I always have a spiral binder. This is how I live my
That's
life.
just exactly what I use.
And
Spiral.
when I started, I didn't know how to pray. And so I wrote, when I was a little girl, little girls had little, my diaries with the little
Mhm.
key. And I always wanted
Yes.
one and I never got one. So here I am in my 30s. This was several years ago. And so I just wrote God a letter instead of Dear Diary. I wrote Dear God.
Oh,
And I began to
wow.
pour out my life. And this is a thicker one than I normally have, but I usually have the 70-page binders, and I would write through it. And then at the end of the month, I would go through and I would look at the different things that I prayed about with God. And if it had been answered, I took a highlighter. Now, this isn't a highlighter. And I would go like this through the page because I knew that it was answered with a
Oh,
highlight.
wow. That's
And then I would
cool.
go through, and if there was whatever pages, there was something that had not been answered, I would transfer that to the first page of the next journal.
Oh,
Well, the thing
wow.
was, is I began to realize that God was working out my issues. He was listening to me because there were so many pages that were highlighted. And it didn't even dawn on me until
Wow.
I could actually physically see it. Then I started to realize that not only these things are working out, but I noticed that my prayers were changing. So I realized that God was speaking to me.
Wow.
It's really interesting because I had a record with a date on it. Nobody could tell me that God wasn't speaking to me or that God wasn't working on my behalf
And
because it was all written out.
you did this naturally?
I did it naturally because I didn't know who I didn't live I lived in a very rural area, didn't have anyone who could teach me. I was embarrassed and ashamed to ask because I had been in the church for years by that time already, and I still didn't know how to read the Bible or pray.
I know
And
exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
exactly. And so I taught myself. And so one of the things that I do in my own ministry, and I realize this is about you, but is that I teach people to do that so they don't have to search like I did. So
Yes.
I'm
Yeah.
totally, totally with you.
Yes.
So let's talk about how you was led, because I know that you have several other books. How did did God tell you to put these into a book? Let's talk about that
Yes.
process. How did you get that into a book?
Particularly this book. The very first book, actually, I don't have a copy with me, is a children's book about angels called Angels Everywhere. Someone saw my artwork at the church. We had it in the halls, and he said, have you thought about writing a children's book? So I wrote a children's book wanting children to know that they're surrounded by these loving light beings,
Hmm.
angels.
Hmm.
And so that was my first attempt. And then I wrote a book about all the angels, the paintings, the first like 42 angels that I painted, because it was a happening. It was an exciting
Right.
thing. But then when it came to this book, I felt definitely led to write this. And I've worked on it for 15 years, collecting images and getting to the point where I retired from church ministry. I continue volunteering with Integral Christian Network, but I was really led to do this to challenge people why they don't feel loved by God and what's getting in the way and what image is stopping them.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, Again, I teach three specific pillars when I teach, and one is we must know who God is. We need to know who God the Father is, and that He's a loving God
Yes.
first, and
Yes.
who Jesus the Son and Holy Spirit. And if we don't have a good image, a true biblical image of who Father is, who God is, then it doesn't transfer correctly, because we're seeing things skewed, and we see that there's condemnation and there's all these other things. And
Yes.
we know that he describes himself, he isn't like love, he is love. He is
He
the
is
very
love.
definition of love. So
Exactly, the
totally
energy.
agree. Mhm.
But I would also challenge you on an image that I call the forgotten image. It's right there at the first part of Genesis where God says, let's create humans in our image. So
Mhm.
male and female, God created them. We have forgotten that part of the image of God is feminine.
Oh, absolutely. I have I
Yes.
totally agree. Where
So
would
I
Eve
have,
came from? She was
I,
already in Adam when he created Adam, and he pulled her out of him and made two instead of one. Absolutely.
yes. And
Yeah.
so I have a whole section of images of God as
Right.
feminine,
Yeah.
God creating woman.
And I
And
imagine that probably raises a lot of
yeah,
hair in
I hope
the
so.
religious world.
I hope so. Yes. And well, can I share one of my favorite
Oh,
stories from the book?
absolutely. Please. Is this your
Here's a
interview?
picture, and it's pretty much of a standard image.
Mm-hmm.
This is called the lost child.
Mm-hmm.
The child is over here. This is
Mm-hmm.
the father.
Mm-hmm.
We know it as the story of the prodigal son.
Prodigal. Mm-hmm.
Not unusual, but the idea that God was letting this person go explore, letting his child go explore, but kept watching for him to come home. And this is one of my favorite stories, a modern day story, the prodigal son.
Mm-hmm.
My best friend growing up, Ellen, sixth grade on, and I was in a small town. I grew up in a small town. We went to different churches, but we were looking, and we
Right.
went to visit some other churches, and we were always talking about God. Well, she found Jesus before I did during the whole Jesus movement. I was studying in France my junior year of college, and she wrote me and said, I found Jesus. And my boyfriend wrote the same thing. Anyhow, I came home, I said yes, and then
Mm-hmm.
off we went. Well, Ellen hears from God, and she has no idea what a beautiful gift she has.
Yeah.
So when she was in college, she worked her way through college in Columbia, in little college, and worked at a restaurant run by a couple. 4 years, that was it, done. 25 years later, the spirit speaks to her and says, I want you to find Catherine Ann. Catherine Ann was the woman of the couple. Well, Ellen had no idea how to find her. They weren't in Columbia anymore. And so she searched. The internet was fairly new at the time. She searched, she couldn't find anything. She kept asking. Finally, she gets the name of the husband and how to contact him. So she calls him. Well, they'd been divorced for a long time, had lost touch. He said, the last time I heard, she was waiting tables in South Kansas City in Grandview, which on the map looks like a spot in the road south of Kansas City. Ellen lives in South Missouri, south of the Ozarks. So she had a jewelry business and was coming to a trade show in Kansas City, decided, I'll go early. I'll try to find Catherine Ann. Now, this has been going on for months. And
Right.
when you get that call on your heart, you just
Yep.
keep looking.
Yep.
So she thought, I'll go early, I'll look. She said, I got to Grandview and there were 3 exits on the highway. I thought Grandview was small, but she thought, oh, there's a building over there that looks like a hotel with a restaurant on the main floor. I'll start there. So she goes over and the restaurant's closed. She says, well, I'll go in the hotel. There'll be somebody there. And now I have to make up a story about what I'm doing. So she goes in and there's a man at the desk and she says, I have a friend who used to wait tables at the restaurant here. And I wonder if you knew anything about Catherine Ann. He says, Kathy, she's in the back. I'll go get her.
Wow.
And Catherine Ann comes out and says, Ellen, what are you doing here? And Ellen said, could we go talk? So they go over in the corner and Ellen said, is there any reason God would send me to find you? And Catherine Ann burst into tears and said, I used to be so close to God, but I got in with a group of people and they just don't care. And I've been drifting away.
Yeah.
So God sends Ellen to find her.
Absolutely. What a beautiful story. It's
Yes.
just
And I have a
absolutely
lot of
beautiful.
stories in the book
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And so how the book goes, let's talk about how, for those who are interested in this kind of a conversation. So it looks like you, from what you've shown me and you told us, is that there are pictures and then there are some explanations, or is it a workbook?
Yes, I
Let's
write a
talk
little
about the format.
I write a little explanation about the picture and ask questions for how could a person consider, does this speak to me? Is this true for me? Here's one of the most common conceptions about God. This is the angry sky god,
Mm-hmm.
and he's keeping a list
Ah,
of sins,
yeah.
keeping a list of what we do wrong. And many people that I talk to have this image of God who's out to get us, and he's keeping track of what we do wrong.
Yeah.
And is a
I call
very
him the Fleischwater God. He's up there waiting to smack us down.
That's right. That's right. And so
Yeah.
so that's a very frequent image that people have. I divide in sections. The first section is what's called urban legends. And there are things we believe about God that we didn't necessarily learn in church, but just picked up in the culture. This is one of them, that God's this angry being. And so that's the first section. And I try to debunk those things. Question: does this fit for you? Why does this fit for you? How could this be wrong? How did you come to believe this about God? Helping people. And there's space. I do a little explanation, and then there's space to write a journal for what you think about the image. Here's like a journal page.
Right.
So I go through that. Then I touch on just a very few Old Testament images of God.
Mm-hmm.
And they are ones that are not human form. Voltaire, the French writer, said, God created man in his image, and man returned the favor. So many times
We're
we
supposed to.
we project on God that he's human like us.
Yeah.
And how many times do you hear people say, well, how can God do all this at the same time? How can God be here and God be there? Well, the nature of God is different from being human.
Yeah.
And so so I challenge that with the Old Testament has like the burning bush. That was not a human image of God. It was presence of God, and
Right.
spoke to Moses. So I do that. And then there are New Testament ones. And one thing I really want people to pay attention to, sometimes I think we make the mistake of including the Old Testament and the New Testament as one message, but it's not. It's two different messages. One is the history of the covenant with God and God establishing law. But Jesus comes to renew the image of God, to show that it's not about law, it's about this intimate connection with God. And God is not the condemning rule maker, but the loving Father who communes with us, guides us, leads us, speaks to us, loves us. And so sometimes I think it's a mistake to act as if it's all one message, because it's not. Jesus came to redeem the law. And so I think that's an important distinction. And I try to show that in the New Testament images.
Right. And so it sounds to me like it's a pretty round statement, I guess, lack of words, statement, explanation of who God is and how he relates to us in regards to him being a loving God. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's
Yes.
cool. That's very
And
cool.
I also push the envelope.
Mhm.
My mentor, Paul Smith, wrote a book called Integral Christianity, The Spirit's Call to Evolve. And he describes the Trinity in a different way that I really like. He describes it as God beyond us, God beside us, God being us, God
Mm.
within us.
Yeah.
And it pushes us to understand God as non-human form, but even as energy, and the energy, the personal energy that is love.
Hmm.
That's
Interesting.
dynamic. And I think we need to start thinking of new ways of thinking of God that way.
Yeah. So now, Marcia, people can get your book on Amazon and Thrift Books. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
Amazon.com and thriftbooks.com.
Show your book again. So the folks out there, here's the book. It's by Marcia Fleischman, If God is Love, Why Do We Feel So Bad? And you can see the secondary title down there, Considering Our Images of God. It sounds like it's a great exploration through art. Those of you who are creative, this would be a good book for you in the aspect of I falter in my words here. I have a very good friend who calls herself a creative because she thinks in color and she thinks in design, and I think in straight lines. I'm very analytical. And so we're very good friends because I'll say, how would you explain this? Because she does it differently than I do. And will say it this way. And so the two, as far as I'm concerned, really give a better view because there's some
Yes, a
different ways
rounded
to look at
view.
things. But for someone who thinks like she does, who is very creative, that's the term we use, who thinks in color and design and circles, and curvy and all those different things. And I'm straight out there, very along the, very analytical.
Very
Uh,
left-brained.
yeah,
Yeah,
so those types of people would be really could be really encouraged by this book. Is that right?
I think so. And two, you couldn't be more surprised than I am that I'm doing this. I
Yeah.
mean, I am a left brain person too. I'm a planner, I'm a
Mhm.
thinker,
Yep.
linear thinking. And then
Yep.
this hit me like
Yeah.
this opening to
Point,
my
point, point,
creative side.
point, point. Yep,
Yes,
exactly.
but then creative side just started to blossom. And
Yeah.
I find I sit and listen to the spirit, and it opens up for me that way. So
Well, there's such a huge aspect of God who is creator.
yes,
And he is
yes,
creator. Everything else is a created being. And so all creation
yes.
comes from him. And so I really think that each part of us has a place within us that it's creative. It's just those who learn to listen to it and those who don't, right?
Yes,
I
and
don't slow down long enough to listen,
well,
and
we have to take our time, that's for sure.
that is
Yes.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a delight, and
Yeah.
my further interest is praying for people and hearing, interesting experience and resonating prayer. One woman said, when someone prays for me like that, God says the nicest things to me." And we
Yeah.
found that God does. When you hear from God, you are blessed and loved,
Right. And
cherished.
in the circles that I walk in, we call that prophetic prayer.
Yes,
They're
exactly.
connecting and speaking over people what God is saying about their life. Absolutely.
Exactly, exactly,
So
and I
what
love it.
else? Yeah, absolutely. So just different terms, different semantics for
Uh-huh.
sure. So, Marcia, what else about the book that I may not have known to ask? Would you like to tell us about maybe an experience or something that's particularly in the book that you'd like to share with the audience today?
Well, I just encourage people to challenge themselves. God doesn't just show up on your doorstep. We have to be looking and opening and challenging ourselves to new ways of seeing, to new experiences. So I want to just encourage people to use this book. It's a workbook, and it could take time to consider what people have been thinking about, what they've been thinking about God. So I just want to invite people to challenge themselves by looking into this subject to see if they can open more to the presence of God's love.
Mhm. I appreciate that, Marcia. I really do because even the scripture tells us that he stands at the door and knocks. We still have to get up and go open the door because it says if
Exactly,
he answers the door,
exactly.
he'll come in. So he is also waiting for us to make that step towards him. So I appreciate that analogy. So I want to encourage the audience out there that you need to go over to Amazon.com and Thrift Books and grab that book. Put that book up there again, Marcia, so we can see that. If God is love, why do I feel so bad? That just sounds like it's a great little workbook for those of you that are creatives and probably even those of us who aren't. It will help, it will stretch us. And the word that she used is challenge you to think a little bit differently. And we can all be challenged to think a little bit differently. So we are out of time today, but I hope you've enjoyed listening as much as I have enjoyed meeting my new friend Marcia and talking to our author. And we want to thank our sponsor, theauthorhub.com, for helping us make this program, the Author Spotlight, happen. So again, as I've said before, and I want to say it again, go on over to Amazon.com or Thrift Books. That's kind of interesting. We've not had an author tell us we could get their books at Thrift Books. So go over there. If you're like me, I like to check lots of places because I'm always going to have a new book, which I have about 10 of them I'm trying to read. So we're getting to those. So I want to remind you and tell you thank you to Marcia. Thank you for being our guest today. And those in the audience, we appreciate you and we appreciate you stopping by and spending time with us here on the Author Spotlight. And we will see you next time. God bless you.